Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of webinars, Getting Ready for You Fall 2017. This webinar is going to talk about services for students with disabilities. And if you're wondering who is talking to you right now, my name is Sarah Tregoning, and I am the Student Accessibility and Success Advisor here at the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta. You can see my contact information on the screen, but I will also have it again at the end of the presentation. So who is this webinar designed for? Well, as you may be able to guess from the image on your screen, this webinar is designed for students with disabilities and their parents, because parents like to have the same information as their students. So the term disabilities is fairly common, and most people understand it to include certain things. So what kinds of disabilities am I talking about? Well, students who are deaf or hard of hearing, blind or partially sighted, students who have ADD, ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or learning disabilities. Students with mental health conditions, so things like depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, or other anxiety disorders, psychiatric conditions or diagnoses that you're familiar with, or students with brain injuries, including concussion. That counts as a disability. Students with chronic medical or systemic health conditions, so things like epilepsy, diabetes, cancer, things we think about when we think about diseases or disabilities, but this also can include allergies or migraines, so things that affect you on a systemic level. And finally, mobility and functional limitations. So for example, if you are a student with cerebral palsy or rheumatoid arthritis, if you use walking aids or other adaptive things to help improve your function, we would classify that as a mobility or functional limitation. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the basic categories we are including when we talk about disabilities. So what are we going to talk about today in this webinar? Well, we're going to talk about what is Student Accessibility Services. So that is the office that I work in. How does that relate to students with disabilities? What is the relevant university policy? So everything a university does basically is guided by policy. What's the relevant policy here? Who is eligible or ineligible for SAS, Student Accessibility Services? And how do you receive those services? What do you need to do to make sure you get the support you need? What accommodations are available, which is the term we use to describe the supports and services students with disabilities receive? And what funding is available? One of the big issues around university is paying for it. So is there funding available that you can use? And what are the important dates and deadlines? There's a few key dates that you want to be aware of, so we'll talk about that. Some things to think about as we are talking about services for students with disabilities, questions to ask yourself before you head off to university. The sooner the better. What are the potential joys and challenges of university life? So if you're heading off to university to post-secondary studies for the first time, what are the things you're excited about and looking forward to? And what are the things that you're a little worried about that you think might make life a little more difficult? What are some ways to address those challenges? The things you're excited about, they're going to be fun when you get here. The things that you're worried about that you think might be potential problems, how are you going to deal with them when they arise? Whoops. And what information do you need to feel prepared? You know, the Boy Scout motto of be prepared, that's actually the motto of public health and any good health management system. Be prepared. And being prepared requires information, a lot of which we're going to talk about in this webinar. And it's what kind of supports are available to help me be successful and achieve my academic goals. Whether your goal is to successfully finish your first year or to go on to be a doctor, work in other professional fields, whatever your goal, what kind of supports do you need to achieve that goal? Am I ready to practice self-advocacy and discuss my needs with those who are able to support me? If you've been living at home with your family while you go to high school, your family takes care of a lot of things, including often getting the supports in place that you need, taking you to doctors, advocating for you. Now, as you're stepping out, you're moving on the road to adulthood a little further. One thing that's going to shift is, especially if you're living in residence on campus, for example, you're not bringing your whole family with you. So you're going to be the one responsible for advocating for yourself, for making sure that you have what you need. And that's going to include discussing what those needs are. Now, everybody I've ever met who has a disability has been very independent and wanting to be as independent as possible. And one of the ways that we maintain our independence is by being our own advocates and asking for what we need. So we're going to talk throughout this webinar about the things you can do to do that. And what kind of financial support do I need for university? There can be, of course, there are a lot of costs for a university, but there are also costs that are specific to students with disabilities. There are costs associated with that. So what kind of funding is there available to help pay for some of those costs? All right, so let's talk about what is student accessibility services and how does that relate to students with disabilities? Well, Student Accessibility Services, or as we normally call it, SAS, is the office designated to provide accommodations, supports, and services to students with permanent disabilities. Every university under Alberta human rights legislation is required to support students with disabilities. So this office, the SAS office, is the one responsible for making sure those accommodations are provided. We promote an accessible, inclusive, and universally designed environment. So our goal is to remove or reduce as many of the barriers in the university environment as possible so that students with disabilities can be successful. Individuals with documented disabilities are connected to the resources and supports they need to achieve their full potential. And we're going to talk about what that phrase documented disabilities means. If you want more information on SAS, and I strongly encourage you to get all the information you can go to our website, which is http://aug.ualberta.ca/SAS. This is the Augustana website for student accessibility services, and it contains a ton of information and resources that you will be able to use throughout your university career. So all the information that we're talking about today can be found on the website. There are also links to other resources. There are forms that you can fill out to make sure you receive your services. And there are links to the university policy and provincial legislation that relates to students or persons with disabilities. And finally, there's links to the Clockwork system, which is the online system we use to register students and to request accommodations. So what is the relevant university policy? Well, if you go to the Augustana SAS website, so that's that aug.ualberta.ca/SAS/policy, you'll find links there to what we call the Duty to Accommodate policy. And that is the University of Alberta's policy and calendar regulations for students and faculty and staff who have disabilities. Basically, the policy requires that the university provide reasonable accommodations. So it levels the playing field and works to reduce the impact of a disability on the student's ability to complete their academic requirements. It's a shared responsibility between the student and the university. So once the university becomes aware that a student has a need for accommodation, then we are responsible for providing those accommodations. But we cannot provide those accommodations until we become aware. So your responsibility as the student is to make sure we know about it and to follow the official procedures and processes to determine what reasonable accommodation is. And again, it's not going to remove everything, but we want to reduce the impacts, okay? It also does not imply that any academic standards are lowered for students with disabilities. Every university degree needs to be worth the same, right? So when you go out into the world and say you have a degree from the University of Alberta, Augustana campus, you want people to know that it is 100% valid and as valuable as anybody else's degree. So anything that is a core competency of your degree is something you have to meet. So it's not that you're going to be marked easier or that you're not going to have to complete requirements, but we're going to provide the accommodations you need to be successful. So just because you have a degree, for example, it doesn't mean that you have to be fully sighted to receive that degree. There are alternative formats that you can receive to get this information you need to be successful. That's just one example. And it does not provide an advantage to students with disabilities. So again, this is about leveling the playing field for making sure that your courses are as accessible to you as we can make them, and as accessible as they are to students without that disability. That's our goal. So who is eligible to receive SAS support? That is the question. Well, as you may have guessed, Augustana students who have documentation of a permanent disability completed by a qualified professional. So again, SAS provides supports to students with a permanent disability, okay? And you must have documentation of that disability. Now, we may begin serving students who are in the process of obtaining documentation, but those services will only be offered on an interim basis. So there will be a deadline by which you must have provided your documentation. If you do not provide that documentation, or if you've gone through, you've been working on getting a diagnosis, or you've gone for a psychoeducational assessment and no disability can be established, then what will happen is I will be referring you for services elsewhere. Okay, so you will still have access to some services, but they will not be provided by SAS. So who is not eligible for SAS support? Well, students who self-diagnose with any disorder. So what sometimes happens is a student will come in and say, I have test anxiety, I need to receive accommodations. Test anxiety is not a permanent disability, okay? It's a situation-specific thing that happens. And we do not provide services for students without a permanent disability. So I can refer you for help because I also do the student success side of things. Then there may be workshops on exams that you want to take. Maybe you want to work with university counselors on coping with your anxiety. That's fine. But SAS will not be the one providing services. If you have a temporary or acute illness or injury, so for example, if you break your arm and it's your writing hand that you've broken, that is a temporary injury, so SAS will not provide services. However, the university is obligated to still provide you with accommodations under human rights legislation. That's often done in conjunction with the professors, or resident services, depending on what the situation is. If you need information about that, you can definitely still contact me, but there are different supports available. Now, if something starts out as a temporary issue and it turns into a permanent or long-term disability, then we would revisit whether SAS is the one who you should be working with to receive your accommodations. Okay? So how do you receive your SAS services? Well, there are 4 steps to getting what you need. Okay? First, you need to collect your accessibility-related documentation. So if you already have, for example, a psychoeducational assessment, a letter from a doctor or a specialist's report, it has to be completed by somebody who was involved in your diagnosis or treatment, and it needs to specify some particular information. So it has to specify the nature of your disability, and I mean a specific diagnosis. So if your doctor writes test anxiety, okay, that's not a disability. What's the specific disability, if there is one? Okay, if you have generalized anxiety disorder and exams exacerbate that condition, that's different, okay? But then they need to put generalized anxiety disorder. How long has the condition been present and is expected to persist? So is this something that's lifelong? Is this something you've been dealing with for 2 years and we don't know when it's going to resolve? Because the services you receive are based on whether it's temporary or permanent, and funding is based on whether something is temporary or permanent. We need that information, okay? And the impact your condition has had on your ability to manage the demands of the academic environment. So how does it impact you when you're in the classroom? How does it impact your note-taking, your exam writing, your reading and writing, or your ability to live in residence? Okay, these are all places where you could be impacted, and the medical professional who fills out this form needs to specify those impacts. Once you have got your accessibility-related documentation, then you need to complete the appropriate registration form. These can be found on the og.ualberta uwalberta.ca/SAS website. If you go to under Students, Register with us. Okay? There are 2 forms there. Now there are 2 options. So there's a new student registration package, and there are 2 versions of that package. One is the one on the left on this screen, which is a new student registration package for students with a documented accessibility related need. So if you have documentation, if you have an official diagnosis, you've got a record of it, this is the form for you. If you have a need but you do not yet have the documentation, then you need to complete the form on the right, which is the new student registration package for students without a documented accessibility related need. Okay, they're slightly different, although they contain a lot of the same information. So you complete that form, and then there is another form that is part of that package, which is the verification of disability form. This is the form that we have specifically created because it asks for all of that information that we just said we need to have related to your disability. So this is the form, even if you've already got a letter from your doctor, if you want to go back and see your doctor and take them this form, then you've done what you need to do to make sure they've provided the information we need to assess you for SAS. Once you've completed these forms, then you will email them to me, the SAS advisor, at ogsas@ualberta.ca. Okay? Once I receive those forms and have put you into the system, then we will meet either in person or by phone to go over that information. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about how your disability impacts you while you're pursuing your studies. So what's your impact in access to everything, in learning, or your performance? We'll look at a variety of accommodations or next steps if there are things that we need to get before we can assess your accommodations, and we'll decide together. We'll enter that information into the Clockwork system, which is the system we use to register all students with student accessibility services. And then I will send you a follow-up email that just goes over, it summarizes everything we will have talked about in that meeting. Okay? So once we have met, the next thing you need to do is really get to know the Clockwork system. Because this is the system, the program through which your accommodations are being arranged and your information is entered, you need to know what's in there and you need to be able to access it. So if you go to, again, the og.ualberta.ca website /clockwork, you will see a login screen, which I've brought up on the screen here. The way you log into it is the same way you log into BearTracks or your university email. It all uses the same CCID, which is your campus computing identification, and password. So it's really simple. Once you've set it up, it's all the same. So you log into that from the website, and that is going to pull up this next screen. So if you see at the top, there's the main menu. Just below it, there are 5 screens. So there's Help, if you have questions about how to use this system. Schedule a test, midterm, or quiz, or schedule a final exam. They're slightly different. So when if one of your accommodations is exam accommodations, this is how you book your exams to make sure you receive your accommodations. My upcoming events. This is where you can log in. And I've just lost, oh, there we go. There we go. I found the pen. My upcoming events is where you can log in and see if you have any meetings with me coming up, they'll be listed under my upcoming events. If you have exams coming up that you've registered, they'll be listed there and you can see where and when you're writing them. Everything's listed right there. And then accommodations, this is where you get your letter, which informs your professor of your accommodations. So if you have SAS services and supports that impact your professor in any way, so if you receive exam accommodations, if you're going to have a note taker, if you're going to be recording lectures, your professors need to know that you've been authorized by SAS to receive these supports. And there are things that they need to do to make sure you get those services. So we prepare a letter of accommodation for you to give your professor to tell them that you are in fact registered for these services. So in Clockwork, you can go in and print your letter of accommodation. And this on the screen is what it looks like. So again, you can see it is a form letter. It's very generalized, okay? So it'll have the date, the professor's name will be right here, what class we're talking about right here. This is to confirm that your name and student ID is registered with Student Accessibility Services and has provided confidential documentation that warrants accessibility-related accommodations under the university's duty to accommodate policy. So you can see when you look at this letter, there is no detail about what your disability is or anything like that. This is just telling the professor only what they need to know. Further down, you can see which accommodations the professor needs to know about. So again, this is only the things that they are partially responsible for. So this will have the list. It will say when your accommodations expire. So normally, if you've got your proper documentation, it will be at the end of the academic year. And list the ones that are relevant to the professor. So exam accommodations, alternate format course materials. So maybe you get digital copy or audio copies of your materials, and the professor needs to provide things for that. This letter gives them the information they need, and it's for them to keep on file. But you can see it is not sharing any of the details that you have discussed with me, your SAS advisor. Once you have given your professor that letter of accommodation, at that point they're required to provide you with your accommodations. If you do not give your professor that letter, they aren't, okay? So it's very important that you inform them, and I strongly recommend you do it within the first week of classes to make sure that you get everything you need. So what accommodations are available? Reasonable accommodations are based on the way your permanent disability impacts your ability to be successful at university. Now, it's important to understand the word reasonable. This doesn't mean that if your physician lists 20 things that they think you should have, you're going to receive all 20 things as an accommodation. Okay, if your professor or your physician lists that you should be marked really easily, that's not a reasonable accommodation. That would give you an advantage over other students. So that reasonableness is assessed based on the requirements of your program and the impact of your disability. But some of the accommodations may include exam accommodations. So most commonly that is extra time to write your exams, the ability to write them in a separate space from the rest of the class, a low distraction environment. You may get audio formats, you may be able to type. There are a lot of possible exam accommodations. Assistive technology and software. So maybe there are specific computer programs you need to complete your schoolwork. Academic strategies support. So this is additional support and workshops on how to be successful at university given the specific impacts of your disability. Maybe a reduced course load is a reasonable accommodation. So you might be considered a full-time student even if you are only taking 2 3-credit courses. Note-taking services, so having other people in the class taking notes for you as well as you taking your own. Alternate format course material, so as I said, maybe audio format or digital format, or interpretive services. Perhaps you need sign language or other interpretive services. Housing or parking accommodations. So if possibly because of your disability, you need a parking pass that lets you park as close to the class as possible, or you need a single room in residence because of your disability-related needs. Those are all possible accommodations that you and I would talk about to determine what you need to be successful. So what funding is available now that your accommodations are arranged? There is grant funding available through the student loan system, and the way you access it is by applying for a provincial student loan. Canadian students using fundable SAS services must apply for provincial and federal grants. So international students, there's other funding available, but for Canadian students, this is the way the grant funding works. And in order to cover the costs to the university and to you, we apply for grant funding. Now, not every SAS service is a funded service, so they don't all come with costs for the student. So if you have exam accommodations or housing accommodations, those aren't funded services, so you don't need to worry about applying for funding. However, if you have things like note-taking, alternate formats for course materials, equipment, academic strategies or interpreting services, those kinds of things, tutoring, those are funded, and so you will need to apply for student loan and grant funding. Now, you need to apply for a student loan, but you don't actually need to get a student loan, okay? You just have to be eligible. So if you are a student who has their funding already set up, you don't want to get a student loan, that's okay. Go into the student loan application and request a loan of $1. By asking for $1, you're letting them know that really what you're asking for is grant funding. So if you don't need the loan, you don't have to get one. You do need to be eligible though. So as long as you're deemed eligible for a loan, then the grant funding should come through. So the provincial and federal grants that are available to Canadian students, there's 2 major federal grants, and the application always looks at the federal grants first because those are the largest and they cover the most. So the first one, the Canada Student Grant for Persons with Permanent Disabilities, that is a grant of $1,000 per term. So for a normal academic year, September to April, that's $2,000. And it's to reduce your debt load. So you can use this money for anything, okay? You don't have to use it for anything specific and you don't have to pay it back. The Canada Student Grant for Services and Equipment for Persons with Permanent Disabilities is specific though, so you can only use that grant money for the exact things that you are funded for. So if it says that you have grant funding for $500 of note-taking services, you have to use the money for note-taking services. If you only use $250 of note-taking services, then you are going to have to pay back the other $250 and you're going to need to submit receipts showing that you used the money for its intended purpose. And that is something that I, as your SAS advisor, will do with you. So you don't need to worry about it. So the whole grant funding process is something that we will do together. So once you submit your student loan application, you let me know that you've done that, and then I will go in and submit the grant application. All you'll have to do is sign off on the form. So if you're worried about doing it, don't worry. This is something that we do together. So now that you've got the funding arranged, what are the important dates to keep in mind? Well, the first one is June 5th. That is when Alberta Student Aid applications open up. Now, other provinces will have different dates, but it should be starting in sometime in June. So the grant funding requests can be made now as long as you're registered with SAS. Speaking of registering, I would recommend that you do not wait later than the end of July to register. So actually, sooner is better. But if you are waiting into August before you're registering, that's a busy time of year. September is a busy time of year. Um, it can take a while to get registered and get your accommodations set up. In the meantime, classes have started. And with the 3-week classes, um, that class could be done before your accommodations are even kicking in. So I recommend you take care of everything in the summer so that you have everything you need right from day one. So your first year seminar class is going to start on August 29th. All other classes start August 31st. So August 30th, the second day of classes, we're going to have a new student SAS orientation. So this is when you're going to be printing your accommodations letters for your professors, getting into the clockwork system. I'll show you how to use it so you can get everything set up. I'll be there to answer your questions about accommodations or any other services, orient you to the campus. We'll get that started right away. And then that will allow you no later than September 1st to be booking your exams if you have any that will happen in the 3-week term. We want all that set up so that you're not missing out on any of the accommodations or services that you need. Okay, so those are the big important dates coming up first. So that is the information that I have for you today. Um, just think back to those things to think about at the beginning of the presentation and remember that these are all things you're doing to prepare. So by listening to this webinar, this is helping you in that preparedness, getting the information you need. So hopefully this has also helped you think of ways to address potential challenges. And just go over this list in your mind to see if you've got everything you need and be prepared to practice self-advocacy. And remember that you're not going to be doing this alone. My role as the SAS advisor is to make sure you have the accommodations you need, but it's also to help you advocate. So if you're worried about doing this for the first time, you haven't had a lot of practice, that's okay. Augustana University Life is a perfect place to start practicing. This is a safe environment for you, and I'm here to support you. I'm happy to do that. So if you have any other questions, feel free to come talk to me. As you can see, my contact information is on the screen now. My name is Sarah Tregoning once again, and you can email me at ogsas@ualberta.ca or give me a call at 780-679-1649. The website is there as well, og.ualberta.ca/SAS, with a lot of information. So between those 3 connections, we should be able to cover most of the questions you have, if not all. But you're welcome to come see me in person, and I will happily answer any questions you have. So I hope you have a great rest of the summer. I'm looking forward to meeting you all when you get here in August. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to contact me. Thanks and have a great summer.